Exercise 20-26. We're going to journalize direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So Austin Company had the following transactions in October. So just to remind you from our slides in the video lecture, here's Peggy's puzzles, and here are the balance sheet accounts having to do with the products. Materials, raw materials are purchased. They come in raw materials inventory, and then they go into the first process, also called a department. And then once the units are done in this assembly department, they move over to the cutting department, and this company creates puzzles. So the puzzles are assembled here, which just means that the picture is glued to the cardboard. And once that is done, the units or puzzles come over to the cutting department, are cut, and then put into the boxes, which is the direct materials for this process. And then once they're finished, they go into finished goods inventory until they are sold. And once they're sold, they leave finished goods and go into cost of goods sold. Now, the costs that cannot be directly traced to a certain department, like the assembly department or the cutting department, go into manufacturing overhead, which is a temporary account treated like an expense. So the actual costs accumulate on the debit side, and then later when they are allocated to the work in process accounts, these two departments, the account is lowered. So let's journalize the costs for Austin Company. So the company purchased raw materials on account. So raw materials is increasing. Notice it's an inventory account. Inventory accounts increase on the debit side. And since they were bought on account, that means AP is increasing. Of course, AP, as you hopefully remember, is a liability, and they increase on the credit side. Next. The company used materials in production, $20,000 in the mixing department, $5,000 in the packaging department, and $900 in indirect materials. So we need to do, well, what's going on here? Really quick review. They are leaving the materials account, so we will credit that account, and they're going into these different types of working process inventory accounts. And these increase on the debit side. So the first account that's going into is the mixing department. Work in process inventory for the mixing department gets $20,000. And then $5,000 goes to the packaging department. And then $900 goes to indirect materials. Remember, indirect costs go into the manufacturing overhead, and that increases on the debit side. And where did these costs come from? They came from the raw materials. So the raw materials account is going to be decreasing, and of course that decreases with a credit. And that looks like that's a total of $25,900. Of course, I just added those up to get the credit. Next, we've incurred labor costs. So the mixing department is going to get $8,000 of labor costs. So this $8,000 are the costs that they paid to the workers working directly with the product in the mixing department. And then in the packaging department, we've got $3,500. Again, these are $3,500 of wages paid to the people working with the product in the packaging department. And then we've got $2,400 in indirect labor. Indirect labor means people who are not working, they work with a product or in the factory area, but they don't work with one of these two departments directly. So indirect costs accumulate in the manufacturing overhead account. And of course, they accumulate on the left or debit side. And since these are labor costs, this means these are wages, and we don't pay them on the day that the pay period ends, so that's a wages payable. That will be paid eventually. So we add these up, then we get what? About 13,900. Then we incurred manufacturing overhead costs, $9,000 in machinery depreciation, and then we paid for rent and utilities. So all three of these costs have to do with a product. So these are all product costs, but none of them are specifically tied to either the mixing department or the packaging department. So since we don't know which department they go in, that's an indirect cost, and they are going to accumulate in manufacturing overhead. So all three of those costs are going to accumulate into manufacturing overhead. So we have to add these up, 9,000 plus 2,900 plus 1,300. That gives us what, about 13,630. And notice it says prepare it in a single compound entry. So now the credits. The first one is for machinery depreciation. So when we record depreciation, the credit is accumulated depreciation, 9,000. And then the other costs we paid for rent and for utilities. Since we paid that, the credit is cash. And we add those two up. And that's what, about 4630. Now you might be thinking that, well, shouldn't this rent be like a rent expense? Well, if that rent was not a product cost, yes, it would be rent expense, and this would be utilities expense. But since the rent was for the factory and the utilities are for the factory, because these are manufacturing overhead costs, it even tells you manufacturing overhead costs, you know that has to do with the factory. And those will become expenses. In other words, this manufacturing overhead will become an expense once the products are eventually sold. And the expense that they become are costs of goods sold.